Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this special webcast, Tribute to a Life of SEWA, celebrating Ela Ramesh Bhatt. Ela Ramesh Bhatt, affectionately called Elaben by most around her, was born in Ahmedabad in 1933, schooled in Surat, and then went on to obtain a degree in law from the LA Shah Law College in Ahmedabad. She began her life as a lawyer for the Textile Labor Association and then became the head of its women's wing. It was then that Supabai, a head loader, met with Elaben and the world of work of the informal economy unfolded before her. She registered the Self-Employed Women's Association, called SEWA, as a trade union in 1972. Since that time, 50 years ago, Elaben's life and that of SEWA are largely intertwined. Before we go into the life and times of Elaben Bhatt, we are privileged to be joined by some SEWA members who will pay tribute in their own words to Elaben. Elaben was a torchbearer for such voices, particularly voice of women, that are typically not heard. Rag pickers, vegetable vendors, waste recyclers, pushcart operators, and so on. The language will be Gujarati and Hindi, and at the end, I will ask my guest, Mirai Chatterjee, to offer a summary of what was said. I'm delighted that Mirai Chatterjee is joining us today, and with that, I will turn it over to her to introduce Paluben and thereafter Shantaben. Miraji, please.
Thank you, Narayan Bhai. Thank you for having us today to pay tribute to our dear sister Elaben. I would like to start by introducing Paluben Parmar, my SEWA sister, who is a leader of the vegetable vendors in Jamalpur market. And she is one of the oldest members now of SEWA. Unfortunately, many of them are not with us, but Paluben was with Elaben from the beginning. So I thought it would be appropriate to start this tribute with her. Paluben, હવે તમે યાદ કરજો, તમે બેનને ક્યારે પહેલા મળ્યા? તમારી મુલાકાત કેવી રીતે થઈ બેન જોડે?
અમારી મુલાકાત એવી રીતે થઈ કે બેન અમે શાકભાજી વેચતા, પણ અમને પોલીસ ખાતો, દબાણ ખાતો અમને બહુ છે. માલ મારો અમારો નાખી દે, કાંટા નાખી દે. બીજા યુનિયન में હતા, પણ એ યુનિયન વાળે કામ ના કરું તે ભાઈ ખેંગાર ભાઈ ના હતા. એ મજૂર માજન में કામ કરતા હતા, મિલ માલિક નું. આ મિલા में જાય ને બરાબર. પછી એ લોકે મને બતાવ્યું. અમે ઈલાબેન કને ગયા તો ઈલાબેને કીધું કે ભાઈ આ સાહેબ છે પણ આપણું માનશે નહીં, એની જોડે કામ કરતા. તો પછી અમે કીધું કે બેન અમારો હાથ પકડો, અમને કોઈ બેસવા દીધું નહીં, અમારું ગરીબાનું કોઈ છે નહીં. પછી બેન ચાલો તમે બહાર બેસો કે હું આવું. પછી અમે બહાર બેઠા. અહીંયા બેન કે હવે તમારો કેસ હું કેવી રીતે? હું તો મજૂરમાં જેમ મેં નોકરી કરું છું, હું તો આ જે મિલ में જાય એમનું કામ કરું છું, બરાબર. તો હવે હું કેવી રીતે કે તમારું કામ કરું? બેન કરો અમારું કામ, અમે તો ગરીબ બેન છીએ અને નથી, અમારા બાર બચ્ચા શું ખાય? તો તમે શું કામ કરો? કોઈ શાકભાજી વેચીએ. પછી બેન કે સારું. પછી અમને તો સાઈબાગ લઈ જા, હિન્દી હતો કમિશન એમની જોડે. કીધું કે ભાઈ અમને બેસવા દો. કમિશન તો કે હવે આ તો રોડ ઉપર બેસવું તો મુસીબત છે, રોડ ઉપર બેસવું બહુ એ છે. પણ અમારે તો બે જગ્યા, બે ટોકરીની જગ્યા જોવે, અમારે બહુ નહીં જોતું. તો કીધું કે સારું. પછી બેન કે શું આપણું કામ કરે? ચાલો કે આપણે હાઈકોર્ટ જાય. અહીંયાથી પછી સુપ્રીમ કોર્ટ ગયા તો ઇન્દિરાબેને અમારો કેસ જીતાડો. અમને માણક ચોક માંથી 313 બેનાને લાયસન્સ અપાયા, 200 રૂપિયા ભરા. અને અમારી કન તો પૈસા જ નતા ને. પછી 10 રૂપિયા કરીને અમે ભેગા કરી અને 200 નો અમે લાયસન્સ લીધા. પણ બેન કે હવે તમે તમારો કેસ લડીએ તો રૂપિયા તો જોવે, રૂપિયા વગર કેસ ના લડાય કે. પછી અમે કીધું કે ભાઈ બેન અમે 10 રૂપિયા રોજ જમા કરાવશા, અમારો કેસ તમે લડો. પછી અમારો કેસ અમારી બેક અમે ઊભી કરી બેકે ના થાય બેનાની બેક હોય કે સરકારી બેક તો હોય પણ બેનાની બેક ના હોય કે તમને આવડે શું તમે અભણ બેનું છો પણ અમારે ચંદાબેન ની હારા હતા તે અમારે તરત કે અમે બધા સાથ હાલશા બેન તમને પછી આપણે આ બેગ સાખાર બે એ અમારી ઊભી કરી એમણે પૈસા અમારા અમે ઉન્યાન વગર તો કશું નહીં થતું ઉન્યાન હોય અને સંસ્થા હોય તો જ અમારું કામ આગળ વધે ન કે ના વધે બરાબર મને લાયસન્સ અપાયું અત્યારે મને બેનનું બહુ મને યાદગારી બહુ થાય છે સાહેબ અમને બહુ યાદગારી થાય છે
While we wait for Mirai to come back online, let me quickly introduce her. She is the chairperson of the SEWA Cooperative Federation and director of the SEWA Social Security team. She has agreed to speak on Elaben's extraordinary life and the legacy she leaves behind at SEWA.
I just thought that I would just translate quickly that first part where Paluben said that she's a vegetable vendor. Vendors like her 50 years ago were harassed by the police, by the municipal authorities who would evict them, who would confiscate their goods and their weighing scales. And it was then that she came into touch with Elaben because Khengar Bhai, who was an officer, functionary in the Textile Labor Association or Majur Mahajan, the union in which, as you mentioned, Elaben was working, Khengar Bhai suggested that she and other vendors from Danapeet Market in Ahmedabad meet Elaben. They met Elaben and they told Elaben, we are poor vendors, we are being harassed. Please help us. What will our children eat? Elaben took the women with her to the labor commissioner, to the police commissioner. They begged and requested for 2 baskets of space in the marketplace. That was denied to them. So they went to the High Court. And then with the help of Indiraben Jai Singh, they fought in the Supreme Court and won. And that was a landmark judgment. It was in the mid-80s, 1984, I believe, and 313 of us who were petitioners got licenses. We paid 200 rupees each to the municipal corporation, and we also contributed towards the legal fees of Indiraben. And then we started our own bank, our own women's cooperative bank, and it was one of us, one Chandaben, who had the foresight and collected our share capital and started the bank. And she ended off by saying that whatever we are today is because of SEWA, the union. Without the union, we are nothing. No one will hear us. Now I'm going to ask her about her memories with Elaben. હવે બેન ઉપર તમારા ઉપર શું છાપ પડ્યું બેનને આટલા વર્ષોથી કામ કર્યું જોડે
છાપી પડી કે અમે કોઈ દાડો બેટ ના જોઈ હોય કોઈ દિવસ બહાર ના નીકળ્યા હોય અને સવાલે સવાલે બેન સમજાવે આની રીત આમ એટલે મને તો બહુ જ હમણે હું અંગૂઠા સાપશું મને કઈ આ તો 9 વર્ષ તો મેં બોર્ડ में રહીશ ફ્લેટ में પછી સાપ એટલી પડી અમારા ઉપર કે બેન સવાલે અમે કાઈ કીએ ને તો બેન તરત અમને એનો હલ કરી દેતા એટલે સાપ તો બહુ જ અમારી એમની બેનની અમારા ઉપર બહુ પડી સાપ
Elaben has made a deep impression on me. She said, I have never been to school. I am a thumb impression person. What did we know about the outside world? At every step, she taught us about the outside world. And every time we had an issue, she would help us find a solution. I was a board member of SEWA Bank for 9 years. Who would have thought that?
Wonderful.
Aabhar. Thank you, Paluben. Aabhar.
Thank you.
અમારી બેન તમે સાંભળી તમારો આભાર.
Thanks you for listening to her. And now we will listen to Shantaben Koshti, who is a BD worker and secretary of SEWA Union. She's an office bearer of the union. Shantaben, આ બાજુ આવો છો? પાલુબેન તમારો આભાર. તમારે જવું હોય તો જવાય.
આભાર.
We're just exchanging places, and here we have Shantaben with me, my colleague.
नमस्ते.
शांताबेन, आप इलाबेन को कब मिले थे सबसे पहले, वो बताइए. परिचय मैं आप ही दीजिए.
तो मैं एक बीड़ी कामदार बहन हूँ और 1982 में मैं एज अ बीड़ी रोलर जुड़ी थी, सेवा में मेंबर बनी थी. तब मुझे पता नहीं था कि इलाबेन कौन है. तो जब हम मीटिंग में जाते थे तो सुनते थे कि हम जो संस्था से जुड़े वो इलाबेन है, वो कामदारों के लिए काम करते हैं, उनके लिए मिनिमम वेज है या सोशल सिक्योरिटी जैसी जो भी बेनिफिट है उसके लिए काम करते हैं. तो एक नाम सुना था उनका, लेकिन उनसे टच नहीं हुआ था कभी. तो फिर एक बार मीटिंग में जाने को मिला, तब हमने उनको सुना तो बहुत अच्छा लगा सुनकर कि इतनी बड़ी हस्ती, उनकी एक पर्सनालिटी ऐसी है, भले वो पढ़े लिखे हैं लेकिन उनकी पर्सनालिटी ऐसी है कि उस छोटे से छोटे व्यक्ति को भी वो अच्छे से बात करते. तो उनको सुनने का मौका मिला, तब संस्था के प्रति और आदर भी हुआ और दूसरे कामदारों की समस्या को भी जानने को मिला और ये संस्था क्या करती है, किस तरह से काम करती है, वो बहुत अच्छे से जाना. फिर मन में एक सवाल था कि कब इनसे मिलना हो, कब इनसे मिलना हो, लेकिन पता नहीं था. ऐसा लगता था कि तो इतनी बड़ी हस्ती है, किस तरह मिलेंगे. फिर कहते हैं ना कि अगर अंदर से भावना हो तो कभी ना कभी तो वो भी इच्छा पूरी होती है. फिर ऑक्यूपेशनल हेल्थ का एक सर्वे करने को मिला, उसके तहत मैं बीड़ी कामदार के जरिए से वहां पर ग्रासरूट रिसर्चर जुड़ी सेवा में, और फिर सेवा में मैंने स्टडी किया, रिसर्च किया ऑक्यूपेशनल हेल्थ का. उसके बाद सेवा एकेडमी में एज अ रिसर्चर जुड़ी. तो सेवा एकेडमी में मेनली ट्रेनिंग का काम होता है, एजुकेशन का काम होता है, रिसर्च का और कम्युनिकेशन का. तो ये सेवा एकेडमी मेनली जो हमारी इन्फॉर्मल सेक्टर की बहनें हैं उनकी कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग का हम काम करते हैं, ताकि वो अपना परिचय अच्छे से दे सके और अपने आप को और उनके काम को वो विजिबल कर सके, ताकि सेवा एक जरिया है कामदार के बीच का और नीति विषय के बीच का, ताकि उनको जोड़ के हम उनको दृश्यमान कर सके. तो फिर मुझे पहली बार उनसे मिलना हुआ, एक बार उनकी चिट्ठी आई, तब मुझे शायद सेवा एकेडमी में काम करते करते 3-4 साल हो गए थे, शायद वो 94 रहा होगा. तो उनकी एक चिट्ठी आई कि मुझे शांताबेन से मिलना है. तो मैं मेरे कोऑर्डिनेटर के पास वो चिट्ठी लेकर गई. तो मैंने कहा कि मुझे बहन को मुझसे क्यों मिलना है, मैं तो इतना सेवा को अभी जानती भी नहीं और मैं इतना पढ़ी लिखी भी नहीं हूँ, मैं सिर्फ 12 पास हूँ, लेकिन मुझे क्यों मिलना है. तो मेरे नम्रता बहन जो हमारे कोऑर्डिनेटर थे उस वक्त, तो कहने लगे कि आप तो बहुत तकदीर वाले हो कि आपको बहन ने सामने से चिट्ठी भेजी है कि आपसे मिलना है. तो हम और दूसरे लोगों को तो बहन से टाइम लेना पड़ता है. तो फिर मैंने कहा कि ठीक है बहन, आप आ जाइए जब भी आना हो. तो वो आए. मुझे तो ऐसा लगता था सेवा के बारे में पूछेंगे, लेकिन मुझे इतना ताज्जुब हुआ, वो मुझे एक अलग से कमरे में ले गए और फिर पूछने लगे, शायद मुझे मेरी माँ भी होती तो ऐसा नहीं पूछते, और पूछने लगे कि आपके घर में कौन कौन है. मैंने कहा मेरी 3 बच्चियां हैं और मेरे बुजुर्ग सास ससुर है. तो क्या आप बीड़ी में कितना कमा लेते थे. तो मैंने कहा बहन, हम दोनों सास बहू मिलकर 500 बीड़ी 700 बीड़ी बनाते थे. उस वक्त 4 रुपया 1000 बीड़ी का था. तो हम 5-7 रुपए की बढ़ाते हैं दिन भर में, और मेरे हस्बैंड प्रेस में काम करते हैं. तो पता नहीं उनके में एक अलग एक आत्मसूच थी या व्यक्ति को पहचानने की एक परख थी. तो 2-3 साल में उन्होंने मेरा ऑब्जर्वेशन किया होगा. तो मुझे कहने लगे आप बहुत अच्छा लिखते हो और आपकी जो सोच है वो भी बहुत अच्छी है, और आपके मन में जो भाव है वो कामदारों के प्रति बहुत है. तो मैं चाहती हूँ कि सेवा को ही बेनिफिट होगा इससे, क्या फाइनेंस का कोर्स करने के लिए बाहर जाओ परदेश. तो मैंने तो कभी घर से बाहर भी कदम नहीं रखा था. तो मैंने कहा मैंने क्या होता है फाइनेंस, मैं तो इतनी पढ़ी लिखी भी नहीं हूँ और ना मेरे घर का ऐसा बैकग्राउंड भी नहीं है एजुकेशनल. तो मैंने कहा मैंने क्या होता है. तो कि नहीं आप सेवा में से जाओ. मैंने कहा मैं नहीं जा सकती बहन, मेरी सबसे छोटी बच्ची तो अभी 3-4 साल की है. तो कि उसकी आप चिंता मत करो, मैं हूं ना, सेवा है आपके साथ. मैंने कहा मेरे सास ससुर भी है, तो कि उसकी भी चिंता मत करो. अभी ऐसा तो अपनी माँ भी नहीं कह सकती. तो मैंने कहा नहीं बहन, मुझे तो नहीं, मैं नहीं जा सकती. कि नहीं 6 महीने के लिए जाओ, आप अपनी चिंता मत करो, आपके बच्चों की चिंता मत करो, आपके परिवार की पूरी जिम्मेदारी मेरी है, उससे सेवा का ही बेनिफिट होगा. तो फिर उस वक्त तो मुझे कुछ भी समझ में नहीं आया। मैंने कहा बहन घर पे पूछकर मैं बताऊंगी, लेकिन फिर जाना नहीं हुआ क्योंकि घर में सास ससुर भी थे और जिम्मेदारी भी थी। लेकिन वो समय कुछ और ही था कि ऐसे भी लोग होते हैं, इतने पढ़े लिखे, इतने नामांकित व्यक्ति, इतने कामदारों के प्रति, इतना काम तो कामदारों के लिए करते हैं, लेकिन पर्सनली भी इतना सोचते हैं। वो तो कोई हस्ती, महान हस्ती होगी जो इतना सोच सकती है।
Thank you, Ben Shantaben. Shantaben says that I joined SEWA in 1982 as a BD worker. I had not met Elaben. I had heard about her. Then I had the opportunity to meet her in a meeting. And her personality, her modesty, such an educated person, and yet without any hierarchy, she spoke with us respectfully. Then I learned more about SEWA through that meeting, and then also through a survey that I did on occupational health and safety as a grassroots researcher as part of SEWA Academy, which is SEWA's capacity building institution where we do training, education, research, communication. And where SEWA I understood is a bridge between the workers and between policymakers. And then she said, suddenly in 1994, I got a note from Elaben inviting me to meet her, and I was surprised. And I said to my team leader, Namrata, this is what I have got. And Namrata said, you're fortunate to be meeting Elaben. And I met Elaben, and I was so touched and moved. She asked me about my family. We didn't talk about SEWA. She wanted to know about me. And I told her that my mother-in-law and I were rolling BDs, and at that time we were earning 5 to 7 rupees only per day. And she said, you are smart, you're intelligent, you're well-read, and you can write well. I want you to do a course, a 6-month course, which will benefit you and SEWA. And I was so surprised. And she said, don't worry. SEWA will support you with your children, with your family responsibilities. Eventually, because of personal reasons, I couldn't go. But this touched me deeply, this faith that she had in workers and in the ability of workers like myself. अभी मैं आपको पूछना चाहूंगी कि आपके जीवन में elaben का क्या असर है? आपको क्या स्पर्शता है आपके हृदय में जो आपको याद आती है बार बार?
elaben का जीवन एक बहुत ही उल्लेखनीय था। वो एक महान हस्ती थी। शायद ऐसे अवतारी पुरुष ही होते हैं जो कभी कभी जन्म लेते हैं, क्योंकि उनके प्रति जितना भी हमको आदर उतना कम होता है। उनके तो बहुत टच में रही हूं मैं। तो उनको ऐसा नहीं कि सिर्फ कामदार तो सही, लेकिन कामदार के प्रति उनकी जो भावना थी, कामदार को अच्छे से सुनो। उनके अंदर ऐसा था कि सिर्फ हम ही, हमारे पास ज्ञान है तो हम ही बोल बोल कर, ऐसा नहीं है, लेकिन कामदार को सुनो अच्छे से, और वो सुनकर फिर उनकी प्रतिक्रिया क्या है वो भी फिर आपको कहना चाहिए उनको। और फिर उनका एक भी भाव था कि कामदार के साथ साथ हम उनकी बहू और बेटी को भी जोड़े। अगर, क्योंकि जो इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर की जो बात हम कर रहे हैं वो तो दिन प्रतिदिन बढ़ता ही जाता है, तो हम दूसरी पीढ़ी को भी जोड़े। तो उनकी जो भावना है कि कामदारों के साथ साथ अब नए काम तो बदलते रहेंगे। जैसे मैं बीड़ी वर्कर हूँ तो मेरी बेटी बीड़ी नहीं बना रही, अभी तो बीड़ी का काम ही खत्म हो गया, लेकिन उनके में स्किल, दूसरी स्किल भी दो और उनकी पीढ़ी को भी लाओ। तो उनका जो विजन है कि हर एक को साथ में लेकर चलना, कामदारों के साथ में फिर उनकी बहू को भी लेकर चलो, उनकी बेटी को भी लेकर चलो, और साथ साथ में यंग जनरेशन उनको भी लेकर चलो। और फिर उनकी वो भी एक खासियत थी कि भले टेक्नोलॉजी को हम नहीं अपनाते, इतना टेक्नोलॉजी को हम अवॉइड करते क्योंकि हम इतने सारे लोग हैं, टेक्नोलॉजी आ जाएगी तो फिर काम कम हो जाएगा, लेकिन टेक्नोलॉजी को भी रिस्पेक्ट देना है। जितना हमको जरूरी वो तो सीखना ही होगा। एक वो भी हम अच्छा, मेरे दिल में उनके लिए वो सम्मान लगा। और दूसरा वो उनका वो ये भी था कि भले ज्यादा नहीं, लेकिन आपको 2 से 3 भाषा भी सीखना चाहिए। जो सीखने के लिए कोई भी उम्र नहीं होती, आप हमेशा कुछ ना कुछ सीखो। और वो खुद भी कुछ ना कुछ सीखते थे और हमको भी प्रेरणा देते थे कि आपको जो भी शौक है वो आप सीखते रहिए। और दूसरा, यंग जनरेशन के लिए वो बहुत ही उत्साहित थे। कभी कभी जब हम मीटिंग में बैठते थे और मैं उनके पास में ही बैठती थी, तो वो सामने बैठे हुए सभी को देखते थे और ऐसा सोचते थे कि काश मैं भी इनके जितनी हो जाऊं, 20 साल की, 25 साल की, और ऐसा कहते थे कि मेरे पास अब समय बहुत कम है, लेकिन मुझे काम बहुत करना है, अभी ये भी काम करना है, वो भी काम करना, वो भी काम करना है, लेकिन मैं खुश हूँ क्योंकि सामने जो बैठी है वो बहुत यंग जनरेशन बैठी है, तो मुझे आशा है कि मेरी सेवा कोई आगे 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 ले जाएगी। और गर्व भी है मुझे कि आप जैसे लीडर अब सेवा में हो, जो दूसरे लीडर को भी तैयार करते हैं। और उनका एक स्लोगन था कि जो दूसरों को आगे करे वही सच्चा लीडर है। हम तो लीडर बन गए, लेकिन हमारे दूसरे को भी हमें चांस देना चाहिए, उनको भी तैयार करना चाहिए और उसको भी लीडरशिप देनी चाहिए। तो वो मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगता था। और उनका एक स्लोगन था कि हमेशा अपनी पहचान, हम जो भी छोटा मोटा काम करें अपना काम बताना चाहिए, शर्म नहीं आनी चाहिए। फिर मैं बीड़ी बना रही हूँ तो मुझे गर्व से कहना चाहिए कि मैं बीड़ी वर्कर हूँ। और आज मुझे गर्व है कि आज मैं बीड़ी वर्कर से सेक्रेटरी तक सेवा में से बनी। तो धन्यवाद आपका।
So Shantaben says that Elaben was a great person. Only once in a while, this kind of rare avatar comes in our midst. She also said that her love of workers always impressed me. How she respected us, she listened to us, and then was also keen that the next generation, our daughters-in-law, our daughters would also join. She says, I'm a BD worker, but my daughters are not BD workers anymore. They are skilled. They have moved on. And she said Elaben also had always took people along. She was so inclusive. Hers was an inclusive vision. Hers was a vision of bringing technology to the working class, to the workers. She also always exhorted us to learn 2-3 languages. She said we can, all of us keep learning. And she was always learning all the time. She was enthusiastic about the younger generation of SEWA. And then at meetings, when the younger generation was with us, she would say, oh, I wish I was young again because I still have much to do. But I'm happy and I'm proud of you all, the younger generation. And she also had a particular message that she always gave us, that those are leaders who promote others in the leadership. Those are true leaders, she would tell us. And she always said, be proud of your work. You're a BD worker, be proud of your work. And I'm very proud that I'm a BD worker. And today I'm Secretary of SEWA, the union. Thank you, Shantaben. आपका नमस्ते, आप बोले, अच्छा लगा. मैं अभी आराम कर जाती हूँ.
Namaste. Thank you so much. That was both touching and I think in a way has pretty much done what we will only round off in the next several minutes, Miraben. So I'm particularly delighted that you will speak with us today. I know you've worked with Elaben for over 4 decades now and have been involved in many of the initiatives that both Paluben and Shantaben just spoke about. So welcome again, Miraben. And may I, before we even begin speaking about Elaben, ask you to say a few words about what SEWA is today and where it's sort of headed.
Thanks again, Narayan Bhai, for having me and my SEWA sisters, Paluben and Shantaben. SEWA, as my sisters said, is a union. We are registered as a trade union. We are India's and perhaps the world's largest national union of informal women workers. Our paid-up membership is 21 lakhs, 2.1 million across 18 states of India. So we are registered, if you will, the flagship organization is the union. But we are a very different type of union because we are a union of self-employed. Most of us have no fixed employer-employee relationship at all. And we are also a different type of union because we are not simply a union, we're also a movement. We are actually a family of organizations within the movement, including 110 cooperatives in Gujarat and other parts of the country, and then other membership-based organizations of poor women, of self-employed women. They could be farmer-producer organizations or village-level self-help groups. So that's why SEWA is both a union and also a movement, as I said. SEWA works mainly on 4 main pillars. As Elaben always said, these must happen simultaneously. One is capitalization, which is savings, credit, financial services, asset building, and in women's name. One of the things Elaben always felt was what kept women in poverty or poor people in our country poor was that they had no access to assets, particularly women. They didn't own anything. Everything was in the man's name, and unfortunately that continues to today. The second pillar is social security or social protection, by which we mean at SEWA at least healthcare, childcare, insurance, pension, and housing with basic infrastructure like a tap and toilet in every home. The third pillar is capacity building. As you heard from Narayan, we have an institution dedicated to capacity building because most of the informal women workforce have never had access to skills or higher education. And the fourth, and most importantly in some ways, is voice and representation. Because in countries like ours, where more than 93% of the workforce are informal, still we are nowhere on the policy table, particularly women workers. No voice, no representation. So through the years, through SEWA's praxis and organizing women, organizing being the basic building block of SEWA, Elaben developed our goals, which are for full employment at the household level and self-reliance. And unpacking this a little further, full employment means work and income security, food security, and social security. And I just now unpacked social security for you, those different elements. And self-reliance is both financial viability of the individual worker and her enterprise like a cooperative, but also decision-making and control, freedom from fear, autonomy, so important for women in particular in Indian society and in the Indian economy. The other aspect of SEWA's work, 2 other aspects I'd like to stress on, is the inspiration from Gandhian values, truth and nonviolence, of course, but Sarvadharam, Swadeshi, respect for all faiths in our multi-faith, multilingual, multi-everything country, and Swadeshi, which is generating local employment. All her life, and particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, she was very concerned about reducing the distance between producers and consumers. Not only is it good for the producers and for the workers, but it's also good for the planet because if it's employment and work. And then also the last important aspect of SEWA's work is policy. Elaben often said that perhaps the biggest struggle of all was what she called the struggle of concepts. That the outside world didn't recognize the work, the significant economic contribution of poor women of our country, and globally actually as well. And that was the biggest insult or the biggest neglect of all. So a very important part of her work, which we've tried to continue at SEWA, is to bring out the issues of informal women workers. Be they the issues of street vendors, as you heard from Paluben, or home-based workers like Shantaben, or whatever the issues are of poor working women of our country and globally also. And take these forward to the policymakers at every level, from the grassroots level to the regional, state, national, and international levels. So this is in brief about SEWA. There's of course a lot more to say about a movement of 2.1 million workers.
Thank you for that. I think the institution stands witness to an extraordinary life, and let's maybe unpack that a little bit more. We've already got a fair bit of guideposts to take us through it. With your permission, what I'd like to do is sort of give a background to each question and then ask the question only to fill in the gaps for our audience. So let me start right at the top on Elaben's life and say this, that there is this sort of well-recognized principle in biographies that a story of a life must also be about secondary characters. And if a life's worth can be judged by those secondary characters, then the early ones in Elaben's life were truly extraordinary. Mahatma Gandhi, as we just heard from everyone, and then Anasuya Sarabhai, who, for those of you who don't know, was the aunt of the famous Vikram Sarabhai and sister of Ambalal Sarabhai, Vikram's father. Her own father, Sumantrai Bhatt, who was both a lawyer and perhaps influenced her to take up the profession, and the head of the Charities Commissioner. So I guess you got both the legal mind and the contribution mind from her father, as well as from her mother, Vanalila Vyas, who worked, among others, with Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. So let me ask you this question, Mirai Ben, which is, did Elaben speak about these influencers of her early life? And in what way were these early pathways sort of part of Elaben's everyday life and what she imparted to the organization?
Oh, absolutely, Narayan Bhai. She often would speak about the early influences in her life. And she would often say, I'm a child of the times. The times were heady. There was excitement. There was the freedom struggle. We would sit around the dining table and discuss who is coming in and out of jail. Her grandfather was a close associate of Gandhiji and was on the Dandi March. There were always discussions of freedom and the dream and the vision and of Gandhiji. So these were formative influences on her life. And then as a young student in Surat, she was involved in student activism. She was very much influenced by her future husband, late Sri Ramesh Bhatt, who was a handsome, fiery student leader in Surat. And together, many struggles around the freedom movement were organized. And then once India became free, she and Ramesh Bhai spent a lot of time in the rural areas, living and working among the poor, heeding Gandhiji's call, understanding the issues of grinding poverty in our country at the time. And all of these had a formative influence on her, and I believe influenced her decision to become a labor lawyer, and then later on, of course, join the Textile Labor Association of Majur Mahajan, which had been co-founded by Anasuya Ben Sarabhai and Mahatma Gandhiji himself, way back in the early years of the century. And I think that her years in Majur Mahajan and the Gandhian way of organizing were also, she always remembered those were also a major influence. But I also think a major change happened when, as you mentioned, Supabai and others like Paluben, Chandaben, Karimaben started coming to her as head of the women's wing in the TLA. And the whole other world of work unfolded before her, the world of the informal economy. And then, as she says, there was no looking back.
Excellent, excellent. So soon after SEWA started, as I understand it, Elaben set up the SEWA Cooperative Bank, I think a year or two afterwards, that today serves several million women. She was also founding trustee of Women's World Banking, and some years later, the chair of the Indian School of Microfinance for Women. So it seems that well before it became fashionable in sort of the modern sense of the term to be inclusive and terms like microcredit and so on, Elaben was already working on access to capital and what I think she herself referred to as market infrastructure to enable women to succeed. So can you both capture the values that led to this, as well as any sort of particular drivers that she adopted while she went about this? I think you yourself were involved on the insurance side of this, and I think Jayashri Ben was involved a little bit more on the banking side. So she co-opted very successful and more importantly focused people around her to get some of these things accomplished. So perhaps some knowledge about that would be very helpful to us.
Sure, Narayan Bhai. So I think one of the cardinal features of the way Elaben lived and worked, and it's something that Paluben and Shantaben both have referred to, was that she was a deep listener. She listened deeply to women and understood their needs and their priorities. And one of the first groups, and she always said, as we say in Gujarati, Pela Khodana, the firstborn, if you will, were the street vendors. And like Paluben, and one of her close associates and earliest members, and actually my mentor, was Chandaben Jagaria, also like Paluben, had never been to school, was an old clothes vendor, canny and sharp as tacks, and a wonderful businesswoman. And it was Chandaben who explained to Elaben that every day they went to the merchant, they borrowed 100 rupees from the merchant, and at the end of the day, they had to return the 100 rupees with 10% interest. So 10% interest per day. And she explained to Elaben, as did other women, that this is crippling. We are bound hand and foot to money lenders and merchants. We can never come out of poverty. And it was the early 70s, and at that time, the banks had been nationalized. And so Elaben, Chandaben, Paluben, and others went to the nationalized banks, and they were in for a rude shock. The doors were slammed in their face. They were told poor women are not creditworthy, they don't save, and we are not able to open bank accounts and offer them loans. So the women were disheartened. The women knew, and Elaben could see that they were excellent savers. They saved for a rainy day. They didn't have a safe haven for their savings, but now what to do? So it was then famously that Chandaben said, we are poor, but we are many. And she mobilized Paluben and others to contribute 10 rupees each as a share. By then, there were 4,000 women registered as union members of SEWA. So 4,000 women contributed 40,000 rupees share capital. And they went to the Reserve Bank of India officer and asked him for a license to set up a cooperative bank. And he couldn't believe what he heard. He told Elaben, you're a nice woman. Why don't you go home and take care of your children? This is a suicidal attempt on your part, and we cannot have a bank of illiterate women. And the women, with Elaben's help, famously stayed up all night, learned how to sign their name, went back to the RBI officer the next day and said, okay, so now we know how to sign our names, give us our bank. And the story Elaben always told was that he was so moved, he literally had tears in his eyes, and he said, I've never seen this kind of passion. You've got your bank. So that was 50 years ago, almost, 1974, when microfinance was not a household word, when women were considered unbankable. And SEWA Bank was formed, the first women's cooperative bank focusing on microfinance, financial services, savings, and then credit, and then much later adding on other services like insurance and pension. And then fortuitously at the Mexico UN Women's Conference, she met Michaela Walsh. And she often said that, that Mexico conference was a watershed. She hadn't been going to so many conferences and abroad. But once she was there, she said, meeting so many women, so many ideas, my mind was buzzing. And then with Michaela Walsh, they started Women's World Banking. And then, of course, Friends of Women's World Banking here in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat, to on-lend to organizations and so on. So SEWA Bank was retailing and Friends of Women's World Bank was lending to organizations of women. So the bank accounts were of women, the loans were taken by women, and whatever assets were generated in women's name. And then later on, in the mid-70s, women said, now we have our bank, we have our union, we have struggled for our rightful place in the market. We're no longer harassed as much by the police and municipal authorities. But what happens when we constantly get sick or when there is death of a breadwinner? And that's how the whole idea of insurance and primary health care came to Elaben. And again, the doors were slammed shut on us by the national insurance companies who said, no, you are bad risk. First, they told us you're not bankable. Now they told us you're not insurable. So ours has been a history of being told by the mainstream that it is not possible. And maybe it was a blessing in disguise in the long run, because we were forced to invent our own systems and our own services. First of all, SEWA Bank, then much later in the early 90s, and then we registered SEWA Insurance or Vimo SEWA as the first women-owned, women-run, women with policyholders insurance cooperative in India, certainly, and possibly the world.
So let me ask you what might be a provocative question. This is we've heard from everyone so far that she was both Gandhian in spirit and in everyday life. Did she see a dichotomy in the use of tools of employment and financing and markets in a Gandhian way, or did she, or would Gandhi have been what Elaben became had he lived into our times? It's a hypothetical. Most people freeze Gandhian ideas in the 30s and 40s without extending it further. Maybe this is what it would have been. So is there a dichotomy, or is that just a natural evolution of time and learning?
Well, first of all, like Gandhiji, Elaben is very practical. Both were people of action-oriented people. And Gandhiji, as you know, believed very much in Rachnatmak Karya, or constructive action. And I think for Elaben, financial services, markets, putting money in the hands of women, the poorest and most vulnerable of women, there's no contradiction. It's part of constructive action. She always said that economic empowerment is critical. It's impossible to have political empowerment, even if you have Panchayati Raj and women in panchayats, if there is no economic power. So she understood the power of money. And she always said that in SEWA Bank, if you go there even today, there is a difference in the way women conduct themselves, hold their heads high, because they have their own money. So the whole issue of financial independence, economic empowerment was so very important to her and continues to be very important to the entire SEWA movement. And so I don't think there was any contradiction at all. I think she believed in simple systems, in appropriate systems. She was one of the first, SEWA Bank was one of the first to start the system of having the photograph on the bank depositor's card, and that's now mainstream, amazingly. So systems, services have to be created, co-created with the people of this country, particularly the poorest, the forgotten, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized. But that doesn't mean you don't do it. It needs to be done. Somebody has to do it. And I think she showed us the way.
Terrific. Maybe before we come back to some of the attributes that you just spoke about, Elaben, simplicity, frugality, all of that stuff, we'll come back to that in a second, but maybe we can take a brief detour since you mentioned 1975 and Mexico, just to remind everyone that was the International Women's Year Conference that was held in Mexico, and many good things were initiated. Some, of course, have gone on to greater strength, like the banking inspirations that came from there. and much later, I think in 2007, it was that she was invited to be a founding member of the Elders Group by Nelson Mandela. So could you tell us a little bit about sort of the international dimension of Elaben? I've heard people say, and in fact, one or two obituaries have specifically mentioned her bounding at her usual energetic self through airports with backpacks on her, somewhat diminutive back. So just give us a little sense of the external interactions that she had through these various entities.
Sure. So I think what is really amazing about Elaben and unique is her vision, her ability to see far into the future, and her ability to understand that the local, the national, and the global, it's a continuum. These are all linked. The injustices faced by Shantaben and Paluben are linked to the larger injustices in the world, economic and social order, particularly as they pertain to informal workers and informal women workers. So from the beginning, the international or the world outside and bringing the world of work of our sisters to the world outside has been very important. Also, the world outside had major influences on her. And one example of that is her whole emphasis on cooperatives. I think what's unique about SEWA and the strategy she developed is the twin strategy of organizing workers, building their solidarity through both unions and cooperatives, not only union. And she said she got the idea of cooperatives when she went for a training at the Histadrut Institute in Tel Aviv, in Israel. And in those days in Israel, she recalled often, everything was done through cooperatives. Even the national airline, El Al, was a cooperative. So she brought these ideas back and adapted them to the local conditions and to her sister's needs. Another very important example of linking with the international was the whole struggle of home-based workers. The worst injustice of all, as she often pointed out, was when we spoke about BD workers to the Labor Department. They said, oh, they're not workers. This is just a hobby. They're just doing this to pass the time. And I remember she used to say, my blood used to boil on this. They toil 8 to 10 hours a day for, as you heard, a pittance, 4 to 5 to 6 rupees at the time. And this is called a hobby. And many of their husbands were laid off mill workers in Ahmedabad as well. This was the sole source of earning for the family. And she took this idea to the International Trade Union Forum. I remember in Melbourne for the first time. And it was a great victory when the International Trade Union movement, even more than the National Trade Union movement, acknowledged the importance of home-based workers. And then later on, there was a convention on home-based workers that was narrowly achieved at the International Labour Organization, one of the big wins of SEWA. Unfortunately, India has still not ratified, but India also signed on at the ILO. So there has been a constant interaction between local, national, and global. And the same with street vendors. In Bellagio, she piloted the Bellagio Declaration of Street Vendors because she realized that the situation of street vendors in Manik Chowk, Ahmedabad, was the same as that of their sisters in Durban, in South Africa, or in Bogota, in Colombia. And so all of these vendors now are joined in an international network, a movement called StreetNet, which she co-founded. So the international has always been there with her. And then for her various the strides that she made in the informal workers movement, I believe she was invited to join the elders by Honorable Nelson Mandela. And there again, she often said that my contribution was threefold: women, work, and peace. And she brought her long years of experience in women, work, and peace to the elders. And recently, Mary Robinson, who was once president of Ireland, was just here to pay her tribute to Elaben as current chair of the elders.
Terrific. I think, in that context, she has so many ideas that I think stand the test of time. For instance, I think I'm saying it correctly when I say that she said nonviolence is not a passive idea. It is ethical activism at its political best. I think the choice of words is just brilliant. That it's not a soft idea, that it carries enormous power if practiced appropriately. And I think Elaben Bhatt has modernized that notion that Gandhi carried and Mandela carried and so on, to be relevant even to today's times. So as you say, and that famous Gandhi's quote says, stay firmly rooted in your soil, but allow the winds of the outside to blow through. I think she practiced that almost completely. So let's get to the personality, the individual characteristics of Elaben Bhatt. There are so many, I don't even know where to start, but we heard some already, but the somewhat now cliched term gentle revolutionary. I've seen reference to extremely empathetic. You yourself mentioned outstanding listener. I've heard the term that she's changed hundreds of lives. I think you might count yourself as one of them, and so on. So could you talk a little bit about these personality? I think she wore I don't know whether it was homespun, but certainly handcrafted yarn all her life. So perhaps some of these things and how one can have this extraordinary impact without necessarily having to buy into the materialism and the consumerism that sort of is everywhere today.
Yeah, I think I'm going back to something that I said earlier and that she always said. She was a child of her times. I think that Gandhiji and his thinking had a deep impact on her, although she always said, I'm not a bhakt of anybody, I'm not a devotee of anybody, I'm not Gandhian, but I'm deeply influenced by his ideas. And I think what is quite extraordinary about her is that she did, which is what is very difficult for most of us to do, was that she tried her best to practice what she preached. And she believed deeply that all of life's issues, problems, even national, international, the most knotty global problems, have simple solutions. If only we care to look, and if only we listen, and if only we dialogue with each other and bring out the humanity in each of us. I think this is also a very Gandhian idea that she felt deeply, that each human being had something important to contribute, something worthwhile within, and also had tremendous potential. And I think this kind of led her to also be very modest and humble in all she did. No matter how many accolades and awards and international and national recognition she gained, she always felt it was it was a collective that owned all these. It was not her personal. She was just a medium, if you will, in the whole process. So I think she deeply believed that. She was also a deeply spiritual person. She exhorted us all always to delve deep and find the spirituality and the divine in each one of us. And I think that also contributed to her empathy, her compassion, her simplicity, because she focused on what was important in life, not on all the frills. she often said to us, the less things you have, the better, because then you don't have to worry about taking care of them or cleaning them or, will this get lost or that get lost. So I think she saw the simple in everything and in nature. I think she felt a real connect with Mother Earth as well and was very distressed by the wanton way we are using resources, the rapid rise in consumerism everywhere and including in our country. That was very disturbing to her. She was always bothered by the mounds of garbage we seem to generate. It's not just a matter of recycling the waste, that of course, recycling, reusing, but also reducing. She emphasized that. So I think all of this is part of a holistic philosophy of life that she lived. So it's not just picking out one simple thing about her simple life and her clothing. Of course, she always wore khadi, but it's much more than that. I mean, I remember she wrote a beautiful essay on the jadu, on the broom, the simplicity of it, the utility of it, and how it's made of natural things, natural plants, actually, plant fibers. So for her, the broom, the simple broom that we all use, the jadu, was not just a simple way of keeping our homes clean and hygienic, but also, it symbolized how we should live our lives, really. So I think those are some of the things. I think on the one hand, while she could see the macro, the attention to the micro, not micromanagement, but I recall many of our members saying whenever they were bereaved, whenever they lost a loved one, she was there by their side, supporting them, reminding them that, life can go on, must go on, and that we are all together in this, in a unique sisterhood of SEWA.
So let me ask, did Elaben speak about sort of the transition of SEWA, or was that largely accomplished in the last 10 or so years? And maybe you can dovetail that into sort of the medium-term plans for SEWA and what its focus and challenges will be in this 21st century. That's the second or third decade of it as we hit it.
So, as Shantaben explained, I think one of the key features of Elaben's extraordinary leadership, unique leadership, I would say, is what she always told us, "Je bija na agad kare te agewan." जो दूसरों को आगे करते हैं वो नेता. Those who put others ahead are actually the leaders. So her whole life was developing others like myself, like Shantaben, Paluben, as leaders of the movement. And I think, therefore, she was from the beginning always planning ahead. So for the transition. So in 1997, she declared at one of our annual meetings that she was passing the baton on. She said she always felt that when she turned 60, crossed 60, she would pass the baton on to younger leadership. And I was deeply fortunate and deeply privileged that she passed the baton on first to me, and then I was able to pass the baton on to other sisters. Particularly today, the union is led by Jyoti Mathwan, who is a tobacco worker's daughter. She's the first working class leader of SEWA, leader of the union as general secretary. So I think Elaben was already planning ahead, as she always did, long ago, way before she needed to. This is highly unusual. I mean, in our country, no leaders vacate the seats, if I may put it that way.
It's not only true of of social service organizations. It's certainly true of politics, and unfortunately true of corporations as well. So I think Indians of every hue can learn from this particular attribute of Elaben.
Absolutely. And she taught that to us. So the importance of cadre building. So after me, there are at least 3 generations now of SEWA leaders. Some, whose leadership is already full blown. And so in a couple of years when I retire, I also retire tension-free, knowing that the movement will continue. So it's not only that she led by example, but she instituted this culture. And particularly building working class leadership, the leadership of Shantaben and Yasmin and Jyotiben, and of course, women like myself supporting them in the background, but having them take up the leadership, that she was very keen on. Also, as part of the transition, she discussed with us the importance of autonomy and decentralization. She was a deep believer in decentralization. She would tell us, Nana thaine mota thao. Stay small while becoming big, meaning not only modest and humble, but find structures that would remain close to the grassroots, close to the very women, our SEWA sisters whom we serve. She always said, I don't like this kind of structure. I like this lateral, horizontal structure. So these are some of the values and the culture that she instituted as part of the transition. And as I said, SEWA has given rise to so many organizations, membership-based organizations, which are part of the SEWA system. She foresaw it as a banyan tree. That would be the organogram, or now we call it a banyan tree forest, literally, because all the aerial roots have formed a veritable forest. All the aerial roots, of course, are touching the soil and being the many, many organizations that she founded. So I think autonomy of these different organizations, decentralized approach, at all times, women in the center, these are the kinds of things we would take forward. And you asked what are the plans? I think the immediate plan is this has been such a major transition for us, losing our inspirational and charismatic founder. So we're still rebooting, we're still reimagining a SEWA, a world without Elaben. And that will take us some time, still fresh. But we, her SEWA sisters, are resolved to take the work that she started forward. We are resolved to keep all sisters united. SEWA is a unique microcosm of women of all faiths, religions, geographies, linguistic groups, ethnicities. It's a microcosm, perhaps, of the dream of Gandhiji and Elaben of what India should continue to be, with women as leaders showing the way for peace and inclusion and leaving no one behind. So I think the first job is keeping us all united, taking not only SEWA, but the movement forward. I've just returned from Mexico, where I chair one of the organizations she founded called WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. It's a network of grassroots practitioners like us at SEWA, researchers and policymakers. And there not only did people pay tribute to Elaben in all different languages of the globe, but also everyone solemnly resolved to take the movement forward in their own countries, as she had dreamed. So I think taking the movement forward wherever we are, more of what we are doing, which is listening to our sisters, building on their needs and demands, taking the work forward. The work is not finished by any means. We have a law for street vendors passed by the Indian Parliament, but street vendors are still harassed across the country. That work needs to be done. I mentioned that there's a convention for home-based workers and domestic workers, not been ratified by the government of India. That work has to be taken forward. Social protection, which is my own area of work. Even after the pandemic, every single citizen, every single worker of this country still doesn't have basic social protection. We would like SEWA Insurance to become the world's first standalone micro-insurance company. For that, the government has to change the law, has to reduce capital requirement. So we have our work cut out. I'm just giving you an idea of some of the work. Quality childcare for all. Women can't go out to work unless their young children are taken care of. We are leading a campaign, a national and global campaign for universal quality childcare. So these are some of the things. And then digitalization. Why should informal women workers be left out of the technological revolution? There is a digital divide. There's a gender digital divide. That has to be bridged. We have a lot of work to do there. Also, more and more enterprises, collective enterprises of women, which are green enterprises, respectful of the planet. We believe informal workers, particularly informal women workers, can show the way forward for climate justice in this world of climate injustice. Then cooperatives and collective enterprises of women to build back better after the pandemic. We're still struggling with strengthening women's livelihoods after the pandemic. I've mentioned a whole lot of policies and laws we want, but they must be implemented. And we know that we can only implement them through organizing, through bottom-up pressure, through pressure from below. What a colleague of mine calls the nutcracker approach, pressure from above, pressure from below. And overall, organizing, that must never stop. Elaben said organizing is like the Ganga. You keep on organizing and more women join, the movement flows forward. And ultimately, it's a movement for social change, reordering the social, political, and economic order so that it's a just world. It's a world that works for all, particularly for the hardworking, informal women workers of India and elsewhere.
Thank you, Mirai. That's. I think we'll leave it at that. A fantastic summary of an extraordinary person. So thank you for your time. I think I'll only quote what Professor Srirama Vayam said about Elaben, which is Elaben herself had a lot of Gandhi in her. We would all do very well to have a little bit of Elaben in each of us. So thank you once again.